The wind off the Missouri River that November had real teeth. It came sideways down the loading docks of the Bellwether distribution warehouse and cut clean through my parka like the fabric wasn't even there. And I remember thinking, right before everything in my life split in two, that I couldn't wait to get home and count the money. $4,112 exactly. That was my holiday bonus from the warehouse, stacked on top of a year of selling hand-poured candles and resin coasters out of a little Etsy shop I ran at midnight after 12-hour shifts. I had it folded into a rubber band inside a zippered pocket of my coat, and I had already picked out the car. A 2014 Honda Accord, silver, 91,000 miles, sitting on a used lot on the east side of Columbus with a sun-faded sticker in the windshield. Derek's Corolla had died on him twice that month, once on the interstate in the rain. He was a third-year resident at Union Memorial. He could not be the guy whose car wouldn't start on a morning he had a trauma page. I had it all planned. Clock out, catch the bus to the lot, put $500 down, surprise him Friday night with the keys tied in a ribbon. Instead, my landlord flagged me down on her bike as I came through the gate, waving a thick manila envelope over her head like she was hailing a cab. "Certified mail, Mara! I signed for it since you weren't home." She was already pedaling off before I'd even taken it from her hand. I want to tell you I had some kind of premonition, some cold drop in my stomach that told me to sit down before I opened it. I didn't. I just tore the flap with my thumb right there on the sidewalk because I assumed it was something boring. A notice from the county, a jury summons, some clerical thing. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. Petitioner, Derek James Callahan. I read the words, irreconcilable differences, 4 times before they meant anything. I read prolonged involuntary separation and thought, separation? We talked on the phone every night. I read his signature at the bottom, that same loose, confident scrawl I used to trace with my finger on love notes he left on the fridge when we were 22 and broke and stupidly happy. And something in my chest folded in on itself like a lung with a hole in it. 6 years. 6 years. 6 years since I'd put my nursing program on hold so I could take double shifts and wire him $1,500 a month, every month, so he could focus on organic chemistry and the MCAT, and later on step exams that made him cry on the phone at 2 a.m. while I sat on the edge of a mattress on the floor of a 400-square-foot studio, telling him he was going to make it. He was going to be somebody. We just had to survive a few more years. 6 years of thrift store coats and coupon nights and selling my grandmother's quilts online when his stethoscope needed replacing. 6 years. And my reward was a court document that arrived on the same day I was going to buy him a car. I did not cry. That's the strange part I still can't fully explain to people. The grief was too big to come out as tears. It just sort of poured backward, down into my stomach, and sat there like a stone. I folded the papers and put them in the same zippered pocket as the rubber-banded cash. $4,000 pressed right up against the document that ended my marriage. And I walked home in the cold without feeling the cold at all. I called out of work the next morning. I threw 2 changes of clothes in a duffel bag, and I got on the first Greyhound to Cleveland, because that's where Union Memorial was, and because I was not going to let 6 years of my life get erased by a piece of paper without hearing it from his mouth. I should tell you what those years looked like. Because when I say I sacrificed for him, I need you to understand I mean it literally, not as a figure of speech. Derek and I met at a community college in Zanesville, Ohio. I was studying to be a nurse. He was pre-med. Brilliant in that restless, hungry way that some men get when they've decided poverty is a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. He used to talk about the future like it was a place he could already see on a map, and he'd take my hand across a diner table and describe it to me in detail. A house with a porch, a dog, me not having to work if I didn't want to, him in a white coat with his name stitched over the pocket. I believed every word. I was 22 and in love, and I had never had anyone look at me like my future was worth planning for. When he got into a med school in Cleveland, I dropped out of my program. Somebody had to earn steady money, and nursing school didn't pay while you were in it. I took the warehouse job because it had health insurance and predictable hours, and I picked up the Etsy shop because predictable hours weren't enough. I learned to live on his stress the way you learn to live with a chronic illness. Quietly, constantly, rearranging your whole life around it without ever being asked if you minded. There was a winter, his second year, when the radiator in my apartment rattled like something dying, and I still wouldn't turn the heat past 62, because every spare dollar was going to his lab fees. I remember frost feathering up the inside of the window glass and thinking it was almost beautiful, in the detached way you notice beautiful things when you're too tired to actually feel anything. There was the week his stethoscope broke, and I sold 3 quilts in 4 days to replace it. There was the semester I worked doubles on weekends so he could afford a review course. There was every single phone call where he was overwhelmed and scared, and I told him I believed in him. And it never once occurred to me, not once, to ask him to hold space for the fact that I was scared too. I made his dream my religion. I worshipped it so completely that I forgot to ask whether there was still a person left inside the sacrifice. That's not a metaphor I came up with after the fact to sound clever for a camera or a page. That's the actual, plain truth of how I lived from 22 to 28. There was a particular Christmas, his 4th year, when I told him I couldn't afford to fly home to Zanesville because the money had to cover his board exam registration fee instead. And he thanked me for the sacrifice over the phone in a voice thick with what I believed, at the time, was genuine gratitude. I spent that Christmas alone in our studio apartment, eating a boxed dinner from the grocery store, watching other people's holiday lights through a frosted window, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself the sacrifice was an investment in a shared future rather than a debt only I was making payments on. I think about that Christmas often now, not with bitterness exactly, but with a kind of clinical clarity I couldn't access at the time. I had already, somewhere in those years, stopped being able to tell the difference between loving someone and financing them. Every dollar I sent, every meal I skipped, every holiday I spent alone felt, in the moment, like proof of how deeply I loved him. It took the envelope on that Columbus sidewalk to finally show me it had actually been proof of something else entirely. How thoroughly I'd let his ambition become the only shape my own life was allowed to take. So when I say the divorce papers arrived on the day I'd saved enough to buy him a car, understand what that means. It means I was still building his future on the exact same day he'd already decided to build a different one, without me. The bus got into Cleveland a little after 5 in the morning. I hadn't slept. I took a cab straight to Union Memorial and found a spot behind a stand of bare oak trees near the physician's lot. And I waited, because some part of me, some stupid, hopeful, humiliated part, still wanted there to be an explanation, a misunderstanding, a paperwork mistake, a cruelty I could forgive if he just looked me in the eye and told me why. At 7:50, a black Lexus SUV turned into the reserved section. Derek got out first. He looked different. Not older exactly, but polished in a way 6 years of med school poverty had never allowed. Wool overcoat, haircut that cost more than my grocery budget for a week. He looked like a man who had already stepped into the future he used to describe to me across diner tables. Except I wasn't standing in it anywhere. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. Tailored coat, glossy hair, the kind of effortless polish that takes real money to fake. She looped her arm through his like it belonged there. I recognized her from photos on his classmates' social media. Ivy Sinclair, daughter of Dr. Marcus Sinclair, Chief of Staff at Union Memorial. I understood everything in the space of about 4 seconds. Irreconcilable differences, voluntary separation. It wasn't a marriage falling apart from distance. It was a ladder, and I was the rung he'd already stepped off of. I called him. It rang long enough that I knew he saw my name and considered not answering. "I'm about to go into rounds," he said, low, like he was hiding the call from someone standing near him. Maybe he was. "I'm outside," I said. "Come explain this to my face or I'll walk in and find you myself." There was a silence, and then his voice changed, dropped into something cold and efficient. A voice I'd never once heard him use with me in 6 years. "Don't make a scene, Mara. There's nothing left to say. We're not in the same world anymore. I'll wire you $20,000 for your trouble. Let's just call it closed." $20,000. For 6 years. For the coupons and the frostbitten windows and the quilts sold at midnight and the stethoscope and the tuition and every ounce of a future I helped build with my own hands, I thought, standing there in the cold with the phone still pressed to my ear, about the winter he'd called me sobbing after failing his first attempt at a critical exam. How I'd stayed on the line with him for 3 hours, while my own shift started in 4. How I'd told him, over and over, that I believed in him, that we were building something together, that the hard years would make the good years sweeter when they finally came. I thought about how many times I'd said "we" over those 6 years, and how completely, retroactively, that pronoun had apparently only ever included one person. He hung up before I could answer. I stood there with the dial tone humming against my ear and the cold finally reaching me. And I understood something with total clarity for the first time in my adult life. A person who will trade 6 years of someone else's devotion for a better zip code was never capable of loving that devotion in the first place. He was only capable of spending it. I didn't storm the lobby. I didn't scream in the parking lot or throw the phone at the pavement, though God knows some part of me wanted to. I just turned around and walked back toward the road, and every step away from that hospital felt heavier than the last, and somehow, underneath the heaviness, cleaner than anything had felt in years. I went back to Columbus that same day, and I did not cry once during the 4-hour ride, which frightened me a little, if I'm honest, because I had always been the sort of person who cried easily, and the silence felt like evidence of something breaking in a deeper, quieter place than tears could reach. I think I was too far past crying. Grief that size doesn't come out as tears. It comes out as decisions. I signed the divorce papers that night at my kitchen table. No lawyer, no fight over the handful of assets we barely had. I wasn't going to give Derek the satisfaction of a drawn-out battle, and I certainly wasn't going to give him the story he could tell people later, that his ex-wife couldn't let go. My signature was steady. I mailed the documents back to the courthouse the next morning, certified, return receipt requested, so there'd never be a question of whether I'd done my part cleanly and fast. Then I did something that felt, in the moment, almost violent in its finality. I popped the SIM card out of my phone and snapped it in half over the kitchen sink. It's a small sound, a SIM card breaking. It shouldn't mean anything. But in that quiet apartment, it sounded like the exact moment 6 years of waiting got severed at the root. Every unanswered worry, every 2 a.m. call where I told him I believed in him, every dollar I'd funneled towards somebody else's future while quietly starving my own. I deleted every social media account I had. I wanted Derek Callahan and everyone who orbited him to have no possible road back into my life, not even by accident, not even years from now out of guilt. I filed to take back my maiden name the same week, Bennett, my grandmother's name, the same grandmother whose quilts I'd sold to buy Derek a stethoscope. It felt like reclaiming a room in a house I'd let someone else redecorate. I resigned from the warehouse the next morning. I told my coworkers I had a family emergency out of state, accepted their sympathy with a polite, closed-off smile, and didn't explain further. I paid my last month's rent, packed a duffel bag with a few sweaters, some of Derek's old textbooks he'd left behind, and the quilt my grandmother made me, and I walked out of that apartment without looking back at it once. I wouldn't move in with my parents. I loved them too much to hand them the image of their daughter coming home broken and divorced at 28. And I refused, on some deep, stubborn level, to be anyone's burden ever again. I want to be honest about how close I came that week to doing something much smaller and much safer instead. Taking a nursing assistant job at a clinic 2 towns over, staying close enough to my old life that leaving wouldn't have felt so much like falling off the edge of the map. I actually filled out an application for that job. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward for nearly an hour, engine running for the heat, staring at the building and trying to picture 5 years of my life happening inside it, quietly, safely, unremarkably. Something about that picture made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with recognition. I recognized, sitting there, the exact shape of a life built around staying small enough not to be noticed. And I understood, with sudden clarity, that I had already lived that life for 6 years and had absolutely no intention of choosing it again voluntarily. I tore up the application in the parking lot and drove home instead. So it was wandering through town that same afternoon, with nowhere particular to go, that I passed a community bulletin board outside a diner and saw a flyer curling at the corners, half buried under flyers for lawn care and lost cats. Rural Health Corps. Volunteers and medical support staff urgently needed. Remote posting. Big Sky Backcountry, Montana. Harsh conditions, low pay, immediate placement available. I stood there, reading it twice, and something in my chest, some part of me I thought Derek had permanently switched off, turned back on. I walked into that recruitment office the next morning. I'd been 2 semesters into a nursing program before I dropped out to fund somebody else's future. And I told the recruiter that. And I told her I wasn't afraid of hard. It's brutal out there, she warned me. No cell service most days, generator power. Nearest hospital's 90 minutes by truck if the roads are even open. People quit inside of a month. I've already survived worse than weather, I told her. 3 days later, my placement was approved. I was headed to an outpost clinic on the edge of the Bitterroot backcountry. And for the first time since that envelope landed in my hands, I felt something that wasn't grief. It felt like the beginning of taking my life back. The plane that took me into the Bitterroot backcountry was a 6-seater with a pilot named Gus who chewed gum the entire flight and didn't say more than 10 words to me, which suited me fine. I pressed my forehead to the cold window and watched Ohio's flat brown fields give way, hour by hour, layover by layover, to jagged white peaks that looked like the spine of something ancient and sleeping. There were no hospital towers below me, no reserved parking, no black Lexus SUVs carrying someone else's future. There was only snow and granite, and a silence so total it felt like it could absorb grief whole. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, nobody on the other end of any line needed anything from me. The clinic itself was a converted ranger cabin sitting crooked on a ridge, patched with tin and prayer. Dr. Walt Hargrove met me on the porch in a canvas coat that had clearly outlived several presidents, looked me up and down like he was assessing livestock, and said, "Hope you survive the winter, kid," before turning around and walking back inside without waiting to see if I'd follow. I followed. The first weeks nearly broke me, but not in the way Derek had. This was an honest kind of hard. We ran the generator 4 hours a day to save diesel. Water came from a well and had to be boiled before you trusted it near your mouth. Supplies arrived by truck when the roads allowed it, and by nothing when they didn't. The locals, loggers, ranchers, a scattering of families who'd chosen this life on purpose, treated the clinic the way you'd treat a last resort, showing up only when something had already gone badly wrong. A chainsaw kickback, a horse-related fracture, a fever that had been ignored 2 days too long. Walt gave me the jobs nobody wanted at first. Inventory, laundering triage cots, restocking gauze, and I did every single one of them without complaint, because complaining had never once gotten me anything in 6 years of marriage. And because, for the first time, the exhaustion I felt at the end of a shift belonged entirely to me. Nobody was going to take it, repackage it, and hand it back as a bill. At night, after the generator coughed itself into silence, I read Walt's dog-eared textbooks by battery lantern until my eyes burned. I copied anatomical diagrams into a spiral notebook. I made him quiz me on drug dosages while he cleaned instruments, and he'd bark the wrong answer back at me on purpose just to see if I'd catch it, which I usually did, and which seemed to be the closest thing Walt Hargrove had to affection. "You've got the hands for it," he told me once, maybe 6 weeks in, not looking up from a suture he was demonstrating. "Question's whether you've got the stomach." "I raised a med student on ramen and rage for 6 years," I told him. "I've got the stomach." He almost smiled. Almost. There were harder nights, too, in those first months. Nights I don't romanticize even now. A newborn with a fever we couldn't safely transport through a closed mountain pass. Walt and I trading 4-hour shifts monitoring her through the night with nothing but a cooling bath and prayer between us and a much worse outcome. An elderly rancher who came in too late for anything we could do, and the particular, specific grief of standing on a porch afterward while his adult son thanked us anyway, for trying, in a voice that made it clear he understood exactly how close trying had come to being enough. I cried after that one, alone, in the small supply closet that doubled as my sleeping quarters those first weeks, and Walt found me there afterward, not offering the empty comfort of pretending it hadn't happened, just sitting down heavily on an overturned crate across from me and saying, after a long silence, "First one's the worst. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Just means you're paying attention." It wasn't much. It was, somehow, exactly enough. I learned that winter the particular discipline medicine demands that 6 years of quiet marital sacrifice had never actually taught me, despite how exhausting those years had felt at the time. The discipline of grieving fully and then getting back up anyway, because somebody else's emergency doesn't wait politely for yours to finish. Derek's ambition had drained me for years without ever once demanding I also be brave. The Bitterroot demanded both, every single week, and something in me that had been dormant for a long time finally, gratefully, woke back up to meet it. The turning point came on a February night I still remember down to the smell of it. Diesel exhaust, pine smoke, and blood. A logger named Ray Deacon came in on a sled towed behind a snowmobile. His leg opened from thigh to knee by a chainsaw that had jumped its guide bar, and he'd lost enough blood on the ride in that his lips had gone the color of ash. Walt was 2 hours out on a house call with the only truck that could make the pass, and the storm outside had knocked the generator dead an hour earlier, so the entire clinic ran on 2 battery lanterns and whatever Ray's wife could hold steady with her shaking hands. I had never closed a wound that size alone. I had watched Walt do it a dozen times, had assisted, had held retractors and passed instruments, but I had never been the only set of hands standing between a person and the floor swallowing them whole. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was the same thing I'd done for 6 years without anyone noticing. I put my own fear away in a drawer, and I worked. I packed the wound, found the bleeder, tied it off with hands that did not shake even though everything else in me was shaking. And I kept Ray talking. About his kids, about the elk he'd seen that morning, about anything, until his color came back and his pulse steadied under my fingers. When Walt finally burst through the door 2 hours later, snow crusted on his eyebrows, he found Ray sitting up, complaining about the cold, very much alive. Walt looked at the closed wound, then at me, for a long moment. "Well," he said, "guess you've got the stomach too." I went outside afterward, into the roaring, white dark, and let my knees finally shake the way they'd wanted to for 2 hours straight. I had been terrified the entire time, but the fear hadn't controlled my hands. It had sharpened them. Something in me woke up on that ridge that Derek's whole, polished, ambitious future had never once made room for. The understanding that I could be the one who saves someone, instead of the one who's endlessly saving up for someone else's saving. That was the night I decided I wasn't going back to being a warehouse worker with a side hustle in candles. I was going to become a doctor. Not for Derek's approval, not for revenge, not for anyone watching. For Ray Deacon, and for the version of me who used to stay up wiring money to a future that was never actually building room for her inside it. It was, I think, the first purely selfish decision of my adult life, in the best possible sense of that word. A decision made entirely for my own sake, with no one else's approval required to validate it. I wish I could tell you the years that followed were a montage set to something triumphant, all sweeping shots of me studying under lantern light while snow fell picturesquely outside. Some of it was that. Most of it was just relentless, unglamorous work. I finished my nursing degree through a remote accelerated program, studying on a laptop that only got signal if I climbed to the top of the ridge behind the clinic. I became a paramedic, then a physician assistant, working the outpost full-time while I studied, because the region needed hands more than it needed me sitting in a lecture hall somewhere. Through a rural medicine pipeline program built for exactly people like me, people who'd come to medicine sideways, late, and hungry, I earned my way into medical school, did my rotations partly in the Bitterroot and partly at a regional teaching hospital in Missoula, and finished at the top of a class that had started out assuming the backcountry EMT wouldn't last a semester. Residency nearly ended me. General surgery, then a fellowship in trauma and vascular surgery, chosen specifically because austere environments like the one I'd fallen in love with needed exactly that skill set. The ability to stabilize catastrophic injuries with almost nothing, far from the safety net of a level 1 trauma center. I did rotations in Seattle and Denver, came back to the Bitterroot every chance I got, and eventually, when the outpost was upgraded to a proper regional medical center with real walls and real power, the board asked me to stay on as chief of surgery. I said yes before they finished the sentence. There's one case from those training years I still think about more than almost any other, because it's the one that finally taught me the difference between competence and mastery. I was a third-year surgical resident, rotating back through the Bitterroot for a stretch, when an early season avalanche came down across a popular backcountry trail on a Saturday afternoon, catching a group of 6 snowmobilers who'd ignored every posted warning about unstable spring snowpack. We got 4 of them alive. 2 came in with crush injuries severe enough that a city hospital would have triaged them straight to a level 1 trauma center, except the nearest level 1 was over 2 hours out by air, and the weather had closed in behind the slide, grounding every helicopter in 3 counties, Wyatt's included. It was just us. Me, Walt, 2 nurses, and a single working operating light, working through the night on injuries that any surgical textbook would have told you needed a specialist we simply did not have. I remember the exact moment I stopped waiting for someone more qualified to walk through the door and simply became the most qualified person in the room, because there was no one else left to be. I remember Walt, standing at my shoulder for the hardest of the 2 cases, saying almost nothing except once, quietly, "Your hands already know what to do. Stop asking them to wait for permission." Both patients survived. One of them, a young father named Kellen Ruiz, sent me a photograph every single Christmas for the next 12 years, his kids getting taller in the frame each time, a small, quiet reminder tucked in a card that read, without fail, "Because you didn't wait for someone else to show up." Over those 15 years, my hands got more familiar with a scalpel than they'd ever been with a whisk or a stack of grocery coupons. I performed thousands of procedures: appendectomies, splenectomies, emergency thoracotomies on the gravel shoulder of a mountain road because there wasn't time to get inside, and the reputation that built up around me in that part of the country was equal parts respect and legend. The locals called me things like the Ridge Doctor, and once I made the mistake of successfully operating on a man who'd been declared essentially dead on arrival, the one who argues with God and usually wins, which I found both mortifying and, if I'm honest, a little bit thrilling. I found real joy out there, not the borrowed, secondhand joy of watching somebody else's dream come true, but joy that belonged to me. And somewhere in those years, without my permission or my planning, I found something else too. His name was Wyatt Cross, and he flew search and rescue helicopters for the state, based out of a small airfield 40 minutes from the clinic. He was the kind of steady that doesn't announce itself, the kind you only notice because it never once wavers, no matter how bad the weather or the injury or the night. He'd bring in hunters pulled off cliff faces, hikers lost 3 days in early snow, once a 10-year-old boy thrown from a horse, and he'd stand quietly at the edge of the trauma bay afterward, not asking to be thanked, just handing me a coffee when it was over, and waiting to see if my hands were steady enough to hold it. When supply flights got weathered out, he found a way to get medication in anyway, off the books, without ever making it a favor I owed him. He never once asked why a woman with my skill set had buried herself in a place this remote. He never treated my guardedness as a problem to be solved. He simply respected it, the way you respect a closed door in someone else's house. And that respect, quiet, patient, entirely without demand, was the first kind of tenderness I let myself receive in almost a decade. I wasn't ready for anything more than that yet, not for years. But I noticed, slowly, that I'd started listening for the specific sound of his helicopter over the ridge, and that the noticing didn't scare me the way I'd have expected it to. The call that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday, 15 years almost to the week since I'd stood behind an oak tree in a hospital parking lot and watched my marriage end from a distance. It arrived as a courier package, thick cream paper, an embossed letterhead I hadn't seen in over a decade. Union Memorial Hospital, Cleveland, Ohio. Inside was a formal offer letter appointing me Chief of Trauma and Vascular Surgery, signed by the hospital's board of directors, with a handwritten note clipped to the top from someone I did not expect to ever hear from again. Dr. Bennett, your reputation reached us long before your name did. We need someone who can rebuild a department that has, frankly, coasted for years on old prestige and no new talent. I believe you're exactly the person for that job, for reasons that go beyond your resume. M. Sinclair, Chief of Staff. I stood in the clinic office holding that letter for a long time, because two things were true at once. The first was that this was, by any professional measure, the single biggest opportunity of my career, a chance to run trauma surgery at a major academic hospital with resources I'd only ever dreamed about on nights when the generator sputtered out mid-surgery. The second was that Union Memorial was the exact hospital where Derek Callahan had built the life he traded me for. Where I'd once stood shaking behind an oak tree with divorce papers in my coat pocket, listening to him tell me we weren't in the same social class anymore. And the name at the bottom of that note, Sinclair, belonged to the family I'd watched walk into that hospital arm in arm with my husband 15 years earlier. I spent 3 sleepless nights turning the decision over before I called the search committee back. Wyatt, when I finally told him about the offer, didn't try to talk me into it or out of it, which was exactly the right response, though it took me a while to fully appreciate it. Only you know what walking back through those doors would cost you, he said. But I'll say this much. I've watched you close wounds nobody else in 300 miles could close. Seems like a waste for that hospital to never find that out, just because the wrong man happens to still work there. I called Walt, too, half expecting him to tell me to stay, to remind me the clinic still needed me, the way he'd have been entirely justified in saying. Instead, he just grunted, in that particular way of his that somehow conveyed both approval and mild irritation at having to express it out loud. You didn't come out here to hide forever, kid, he said. You came out here to become somebody. Sounds like it's time to go show them who that is. I didn't know yet what that connection meant. I only knew, standing there with snow falling outside the window of the clinic I'd built my entire second life inside of, that some door I thought I'd closed for good had just creaked open again. And this time, I was walking through it as someone Derek Callahan had never met. While I was learning to close chainsaw wounds by lantern light, Derek Callahan was learning a very different lesson. That a ladder built on someone else's back doesn't hold your weight once that someone stops climbing under you. I didn't know any of this at the time, of course. I want to be honest about that. I heard it later, in pieces, the way you hear about a house fire from neighbors after you've already moved to a different state. Secondhand, embellished in places, but true in its shape. Derek married Ivy Sinclair 8 months after our divorce was finalized. It was, by every account, a spectacular wedding. A hotel ballroom downtown, string quartet, an ice sculpture of the hospital's own crest because nothing says romance quite like commemorating your father-in-law's org chart in frozen water. Dr. Marcus Sinclair, Chief of Staff and Ivy's father, made sure his new son-in-law was fast-tracked into a research fellowship, then a junior attending physician, then, eventually, Deputy Chief of General Surgery, a title that looked impressive on a business card and meant considerably less on an operating table. Because here's the thing about Derek that 6 years of marriage had taught me, and that the rest of Union Memorial was about to learn the hard way. He had always been better at describing the future than building it. He talked a spectacular game. He had, since medical school, relied on other people to do the unglamorous, exhausting work that turns a plan into an actual result. First me, wiring money and skipping meals so he could focus, and later an entire hospital's worth of junior residents and nurses who quietly covered for gaps in his clinical judgment because his father-in-law signed their evaluations. His surgical outcomes were average at best. His research output over a decade amounted to 2 minor papers, both heavily co-authored, neither cited more than a handful of times. He avoided the most complex cases, delegating them to residents under the polite fiction of letting them grow, and everyone in the department understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that Derek Callahan's career was a greenhouse plant, thriving only because someone kept the climate artificially perfect around him. Then, 4 years before that courier package landed on my desk in Montana, Dr. Marcus Sinclair retired. Without his father-in-law's protection, Derek's career didn't collapse overnight. It did something slower and, in its way, crueler. It simply stopped growing, while everyone around him kept climbing. Younger surgeons who'd once deferred to him in meetings started openly questioning his case selections. A resident I'd later come to know, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Nasser, told me once, after I'd been at Union Memorial long enough that people had stopped being careful around me, that residents used to trade Derek's OR days like a bad luck charm, because his indecision under pressure made routine procedures run 40 minutes longer than they should have. We used to call him the coattail chief, she told me, with the particular bluntness residents reserve for people who no longer scare them. Everybody knew exactly how he got the job. Everybody was just too polite to say it while his father-in-law was still around to hear it. At home, things weren't better. Ivy Sinclair had married a man she believed was on a trajectory, chief of surgery, then maybe hospital administration, a name people would recognize at galas for the rest of her life. Instead, she found herself married to a man whose career had visibly plateaued in his mid-30s, whose confidence curdled into irritability, and who increasingly came home late smelling faintly of whiskey he pretended not to have had, blaming the traffic, the residents, the hospital board, anyone but the plain mathematics of his own unremarkable talent. By the time I received that offer letter, the position of Chief of Trauma and Vascular Surgery had sat empty at Union Memorial for 6 months. 3 internal candidates had campaigned hard for it, including Derek. The board had rejected all 3, unanimously, as neither skilled nor respected enough to lead a department that badly needed rebuilding. Derek did not know, when he heard rumors of an outside hire coming from some backwater clinic in Montana, that the woman walking back through those doors was the wife he'd once told to accept $20,000 and disappear. By then, he'd developed a habit his colleagues quietly noted, without ever confronting him about directly. A tendency to arrive late to complex cases and leave early from difficult ones. A pattern of scheduling his OR days around the easiest procedures on the board, while more demanding cases somehow always seemed to land on someone else's calendar. Nobody had the standing to challenge it while Sinclair was still chief of staff. Once he retired, a few younger attendings tried, gently at first, to push back on the arrangement, only to find Derek reflexively defensive, quick to remind anyone who questioned him that he'd been at the hospital longer than they had, as if tenure alone were a substitute for the competence tenure was supposed to represent. His reputation calcified into something the department simply worked around rather than confronted, the institutional equivalent of a pothole everyone had learned to steer past without ever bothering to report it. That, too, is a particular kind of rot. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow accumulation of everyone's collective decision that dealing with the problem honestly wasn't worth the discomfort of doing so. Before any of that, though, there was Montana. And there was leaving it. And I want to tell you honestly that saying goodbye to the Bitterroot was harder than anything Cleveland had ever done to me. The morning I left, the clinic courtyard was full before sunrise. Ranchers and loggers I'd stitched back together over 15 years drove in on trucks and snowmobiles through weather that would have kept sensible people home, just to shake my hand or press smoked salmon and jars of huckleberry preserves into my arms like offerings. Ray Deacon, the logger whose leg I'd closed alone during a power failure a decade and a half earlier, showed up on crutches from an unrelated knee surgery, insisting on standing the whole time out of what he called respect. Walt Hargrove, 81 now and mostly retired, gripped both my hands in his and didn't say much, which was exactly how I knew he meant it. Dana's counterpart at the clinic, a nurse named Bethany who'd started the same year I did, pressed a scrapbook into my hands that the whole staff had apparently been secretly assembling for weeks. Photographs from 15 years of clinic life. A newspaper clipping about the regional medical center upgrade with my name in the third paragraph. A child's crayon drawing labeled, in careful kindergarten lettering, "Dr. Bennett fixed my dad's leg," which I recognized immediately as Ray Deacon's youngest daughter, who'd been 4 years old the night I closed her father's chainsaw wound, and was now, impossibly, nearly 19 and headed to nursing school herself in the fall. I hugged more people that morning than I think I'd hugged in the entire previous decade combined. And I cried, finally and completely, somewhere around the third or fourth farewell. The tears I hadn't been able to find on that Columbus sidewalk 15 years earlier arriving all at once, in a clinic courtyard full of people who'd taught me, patient by patient, winter by winter, exactly what it felt like to be valued for the work of my own 2 hands, rather than for what I could quietly provide someone else. Wyatt found me at the edge of the crowd, near where his helicopter sat parked on the gravel apron, and handed me a small carved wooden box one of the local elders had made. Under a pane of glass on the lid, someone had pressed a single stem of fireweed, the wildflower that's always first to bloom on ground a fire has already burned bare. "Keep doing what you do," he said. "This place will still be here. So will I, if that ever matters to you." I turned the box over in my hands and understood exactly what he meant, without needing him to explain it further. 15 years in that unforgiving, beautiful country hadn't just hidden me from my old life. It had burned away the parts of me that used to measure my worth by whether somebody else noticed it, and something sturdier had grown back in the ashes. I boarded the plane out with that box in my lap, and a version of myself I actually recognized in the window's reflection. Not the girl who used to sell quilts to buy someone else's future, and not the ghost who'd walked away from a Cleveland parking lot 15 years earlier, feeling erased. Someone new. Someone earned. Union Memorial hadn't changed nearly as much as I had. Same glass atrium, same brass plaque by the entrance, same particular smell of hand sanitizer and burnt coffee that every hospital in America seems to share. What had changed was the woman walking through the doors under it, not sneaking in behind an oak tree this time, but walking straight up the front steps in a coat that fit exactly right, with a security badge already clipped to it that read, "Dr. Mara Bennett, Chief, Trauma and Vascular Surgery." The gossip had apparently preceded me by weeks. I caught fragments of it in the elevator before anyone realized who I was. The new chief's coming from some rural clinic in Montana, can you believe that? And then, from someone slightly better informed. Don't kid yourself, I read her file. She's board certified in trauma and vascular, published in 3 major journals. The board had to fight another hospital system to get her here. I found it almost funny, standing there in scrubs, listening to strangers debate my competence 3 feet away from me. 15 years earlier, in that same city, my competence had never once been the subject of debate, because nobody had bothered to consider I had any. Dr. Marcus Sinclair met me personally on my first morning, which surprised me, given that he'd officially retired years earlier. He was tall, silver-haired, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where he was the most powerful person present. "Dr. Bennett," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that lingered half a second longer than the ordinary greeting required. "Thank you for coming. I know this city may hold complicated history for you." Something in the careful, deliberate way he said it made the back of my neck prickle. I hadn't told the board a single word about my personal history in Cleveland. I hadn't needed to. My CV had spoken entirely for itself, or so I'd believed. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dr. Sinclair," I said, keeping my voice level. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Regret, maybe? Or the particular discomfort of a man about to admit he'd known more than he'd let on. "I think you and I should have a longer conversation soon," he said. "There's a piece of your history at this hospital that I owe you the truth about, but not today. Today, go meet your department. They need you far more than they realize." He walked away before I could press him further, leaving me standing in that familiar atrium with a badge that finally had my real name on it, and the unsettling sense that this homecoming had been engineered by someone, for reasons I hadn't yet uncovered. I met the rest of the department an hour later, in a conference room full of attendings and residents who studied me with the particular wary curiosity reserved for a new boss nobody has decided yet whether to trust. I didn't try to win them over with a speech. I'd learned in 15 years of earning trust the hard way that speeches rarely accomplish what steady, visible competence accomplishes on its own. "I'm not here to prove anything to anyone," I told them instead, keeping it short. "I'm here to make sure this department's outcomes match the talent I already know is sitting in this room. Because I've read your case files, and there's more talent in here than this department's recent reputation gives you credit for. I intend to notice the people doing good work, and I intend to be honest, quickly and without drama, about the work that isn't good enough yet. That's the whole plan. Questions?" Nobody had any that first day, though I caught Priya Nasser watching me from the back of the room with an expression I'd come to recognize well over the following months. The look of someone deciding, in real time, whether a new authority figure was finally going to be worth believing in. She stayed after the others filed out. "For what it's worth," she said. "The case files you mentioned reading? Did you actually read Callahan's?" "I read everyone's," I said carefully, giving nothing away yet. She held my gaze a beat longer than casual conversation required. "You'll want to read his again," she said. "Closely." Then she left too, and I sat alone in that conference room for a long moment, understanding that whatever quiet reckoning was coming for Derek Callahan had apparently already been building long before I ever walked back through those doors. 3 days into my new position, Dr. Sinclair asked me to meet him for coffee in a quiet corner of the physician's lounge, away from the cafeteria where every conversation traveled through the hospital grapevine within the hour. He looked, that morning, less like the commanding figure who'd once walked his daughter through those doors on Derek's arm, and more like a tired old man carrying something he'd wanted to put down for a very long time. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you decide how angry to be with me." I said nothing. I'd learned over 15 years of trauma bays that silence usually got you the truth faster than questions did. When your husband, your ex-husband, began seeing my daughter, Sinclair said, I did not know he was married. Ivy didn't know either, not at first. He told her he was recently, painfully divorced. He described it, from what she's told me since, in a way that made him sound like the wronged party. A cold wife who resented his ambition, a woman who'd left him for another life. I felt something ignite low in my chest, familiar and old. That's not remotely what happened. I know that now, Sinclair said quietly. I learned the truth about 18 months into their marriage, when a colleague who'd trained with your ex-husband in Cleveland mentioned, in passing, a woman he used to be married to. Someone who'd apparently worked 2 jobs to put him through medical school and then vanished into the Montana wilderness after he divorced her the same week she'd saved up to buy him a car. It didn't take much effort to connect the dots. The room felt very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its ordinary rhythm. I confronted him, Sinclair continued. He minimized it, called it ancient history, said you'd both moved on, said it wasn't relevant to anything. And for a long time, I let that be true. Because Ivy was happy, or seemed to be, and I told myself old wounds weren't mine to reopen. He looked down at his coffee. But I followed your career, Dr. Bennett. Quietly. At first out of guilt, and then out of genuine professional respect. Because what you built out there in that clinic was remarkable by any standard in this field. When the chief position opened and every internal candidate we had, including him, turned out to be mediocre at best, I made sure your name reached the search committee. I won't pretend that wasn't personal. I owed you something, even if you never knew my name until 3 days ago. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. 15 years. And it turned out the ripple from that betrayal had reached further than I'd ever imagined, touching lives I'd never known were connected to mine. Why tell me now? I finally asked. Because you deserve to walk into this building with the whole truth, Sinclair said. And because there's something else you should know. Something about my daughter's marriage that isn't mine to explain fully. But I think Ivy would like to speak with you herself, if you're willing. I almost said no. Some old, protective part of me had no interest in sitting across from the woman I'd once watched walk arm in arm into a hospital with my husband, laughing, while I stood shivering behind a tree with divorce papers in my coat. But curiosity, and something that felt, unexpectedly, like the beginning of understanding, won out. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital, somewhere neutral, somewhere without institutional ears. Ivy Sinclair looked different from the glossy, effortless woman I remembered from the parking lot 15 years earlier. Still put together, still expensively dressed, but with a tiredness around her eyes that no amount of concealer fully hid. I owe you an apology I've owed for a long time, she said, before I'd even finished sitting down. I didn't know he was married when it started. I want you to believe that, though I understand if you don't. I believe you, I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I meant it. Derek's talent for describing a future that didn't exist yet had once worked on me, too. Ivy exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. It's been a hard few years, she said. I don't say that looking for sympathy from the person he actually wronged. I say it because I think you should know what you're walking into, professionally. Derek isn't the man my father's letterhead used to make him look like. He hasn't been for a long time. She told me things over the next hour that confirmed and expanded everything Priya Nasser had hinted at in the residence lounge. Missed complications quietly smoothed over by junior staff too afraid to escalate. documentation that didn't always match what had actually happened in the OR. A malpractice settlement 11 years earlier, paid quietly, kept off any public record through the kind of institutional protection that evaporates the moment a protector retires. I stayed longer than I should have, Ivy said, staring into her coffee. Partly out of pride, partly because admitting my marriage was built on a lie felt like admitting my judgment couldn't be trusted about anything. But I filed for divorce 4 months ago. I haven't told my father the full reason yet. I'm telling you now because I think, if you're going to be his boss, you deserve to know exactly who you're dealing with. And because some small, petty part of me wants there to finally be consequences for a man who spent his entire adult life outrunning them. I looked at this woman I had once, fairly or not, hated with the specific heat reserved for the person who gets the future you built with your own hands, and felt something shift in me instead. Not friendship, not yet, but a kind of grim, unexpected solidarity. We had both, in our own ways, been collateral damage in Derek Callahan's long habit of mistaking other people's labor and loyalty for his own accomplishments. She told me, too, about the early years of their marriage, how convincing Derek's version of events had been, how he'd cast himself in every retelling as a man who'd simply outgrown a marriage built too young and too poor to survive his ambitions, never once mentioning the specific mechanics of how that ambition had actually been funded. He talked about you so rarely, Ivy admitted, that when he did, it always sounded rehearsed, like a line he'd practiced enough times that he'd started believing it himself. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. I used to think that was normal, honestly, the way exes talk about each other after something painful. It wasn't until years later, piecing together small inconsistencies, that I understood how much of the story he'd simply left out. I asked her, carefully, why she'd stayed as long as she had, once the cracks became impossible to ignore. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. Pride, mostly, like I said. But also, I think I kept waiting for the man from the beginning to come back. The version who seemed so sure of himself, so capable of building something impressive. It took me embarrassingly long to understand that version of him had never actually built anything at all. He'd just always been very good at describing what building something would eventually look like. She glanced up at me. You'd know that better than anyone, I imagine. I would, I said. It took me 6 years to learn it. I'm glad it only took you a fraction of that. Thank you for telling me, I said. For what it's worth, none of what he did was your fault either. Ivy gave me a small, tired smile, the first genuine one since we'd sat down. Good luck running that department, she said. You're going to need to look very closely at his case files. I hadn't planned to face Derek directly so soon. I'd assumed, given the hierarchy, that our first real interaction would happen in some appropriately sterile setting. A departmental meeting, a case review, something with witnesses and an agenda. Instead, he found me. I was reviewing charts alone in my new office on a Thursday evening, the hospital quieting around me, when a knock landed on the doorframe and I looked up to find Derek Callahan standing there in scrubs, looking, for the first time in my memory of him, genuinely uncertain of himself. 15 years had done what 15 years generally do. He was heavier through the middle, gray threading through hair that used to be perfectly styled, and there was something worn around his eyes that no amount of expensive skincare had managed to erase. He looked, in short, exactly like a man whose future had stopped matching the picture he used to describe across diner tables. Mara, he said, then catching himself. Dr. Bennett, I wanted to say something before rumors got there first. Say it then, I said, not putting down my pen. I didn't know it was you, he said. When the board mentioned the new chief candidate from Montana, I don't know what I assumed. I certainly didn't expect to walk in and find. He gestured vaguely, helplessly, at all of me. This, I repeated, letting the words sit in the air between us. You mean a trauma surgeon, a department chief, a person apparently capable of things you never once thought I had in me. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. I was cruel to you, he said. I know that. I've known it for years, if I'm honest. I told myself a lot of things back then to make it feel less ugly than it was. You didn't just leave me, Derek, I said, and I felt, saying it, how strange it was that my voice stayed perfectly level, not a single tremor in it. You spent 6 years letting me starve myself so you could eat well later. You let me sell my grandmother's quilts to buy your equipment. And when the bill finally came due, you offered me $20,000 like I was an invoice you were settling, and you told me we weren't in the same social class anymore. I set the pen down and looked at him directly. I've thought about that phrase a lot over the years. Social class. I used to think it meant money. It took me a long time to realize what you actually meant was that I'd become inconvenient to the story you wanted to tell about yourself. Derek's jaw worked silently for a moment. I regret it, he said, quietly. More than you probably believe. I don't need your regret, I said. I needed a husband who remembered whose sacrifice built his career. 15 years is a long time to wait for an apology nobody asked you for anymore. Go home, Derek. I have charts to finish. He lingered a moment longer in the doorway, as if some part of him had expected the conversation to go differently. Expected, perhaps, that 15 years of distance might have softened me into someone easier to apologize to. Someone who'd meet him halfway out of old habit or old affection. I watched him understand, slowly, that the woman standing in that office bore only a physical resemblance to the one he used to be able to talk his way around at 2 a.m. over the phone. For what it's worth, he said, one last attempt. I did love you. Back at the beginning, I mean. Before all of it got complicated. I believe you did, I said, and I found, saying it, that I actually meant it. That was, in its own strange way, part of what made the whole thing so unbearably sad, rather than simply villainous. That's almost the worst part, Derek. You loved me. And it still wasn't enough to make you treat me like a person instead of an investment. I don't think you ever figured out those were supposed to be the same thing. He left without another word, and I sat there afterward, waiting to feel something enormous. Vindication, triumph, the satisfaction I'd half expected to feel for 15 years if this exact moment ever arrived. What I actually felt was smaller and, in its way, far more valuable. Nothing. Not hatred, not grief, not longing. Just the quiet, settled knowledge that this man's regret no longer had the power to move a single thing inside me. I want to pause the story of Derek's unraveling for a moment, because it would be easy to let this become only a story about his downfall, and that was never actually the point of any of it. The real story of those first months back in Cleveland was the department itself, the thing I'd actually come there to build. Trauma and vascular surgery at Union Memorial had been coasting for years, exactly as Sinclair's note had warned me. Protocols were outdated. Morale among the residents was quietly terrible. The kind of terrible that doesn't show up in exit surveys because everyone's too afraid of retaliation to be honest in them. I spent my first month doing almost nothing but listening, sitting in on case reviews, shadowing shifts, learning names, learning who'd been quietly carrying the department's competence on their backs while getting none of the credit for it. Priya Nasser, the sharp-tongued third-year resident who'd first told me about Derek's reputation, turned out to be exactly the kind of surgeon this department needed more of. Decisive, meticulous, chronically underestimated by exactly the sort of people who'd once underestimated me. I made her my chief resident within 6 weeks, over the objections of 2 attendings who thought seniority should matter more than talent, and I did not apologize for the decision once. I brought protocols from the Bitterroot that Cleveland's academic surgeons initially scoffed at, techniques built for resource-scarce environments, faster, leaner approaches to trauma stabilization that turned out to translate beautifully to a busy urban trauma bay once people actually tried them. Our outcomes improved within the first quarter. Not dramatically, not the stuff of headlines yet, but measurably. The kind of quiet improvement that shows up in mortality statistics before it shows up in reputation. I mention all of this because I need you to understand something about the next part of this story. I was not hunting for Derek. I wasn't combing through old charts looking for ammunition, waiting for my moment. I found what I found because doing my job properly meant reviewing every surgeon's case history in the department I now ran. And Derek Callahan happened to be one of the surgeons in that department. I want to tell you about one more person from those early rebuilding months, because she taught me as much as I taught her, and because her story sits at the actual heart of why I took this job in the first place. Her name was Dana Kowalczyk, a trauma nurse who'd been at Union Memorial for 9 years, competent and quietly overworked in the specific way institutions come to depend on without ever properly compensating. She'd trained under 3 different chiefs before me, none of whom had bothered to notice that she carried more clinical judgment in her daily rounding than most of the residents rotating through the department. She'd been passed over twice for a nurse educator position that had gone instead to less experienced candidates with better internal connections. Connections that, I would later learn, traced directly back to Derek's circle of favor trading during his years of influence. I noticed her within my first 2 weeks, the way you notice the one steady hand in a chaotic room. She caught a medication error before it reached a patient during my 3rd shift observing the floor, flagged it calmly, corrected it without drama, and moved on to the next task without waiting for anyone to acknowledge what she'd just prevented. Nobody thanked her. It was, apparently, simply what everyone had come to expect from Dana. The same way nobody thinks to thank a support beam for holding up a ceiling. I created a formal nurse educator position for her within my first quarter, with a salary that actually matched the responsibility, over the mild objection of an administrator who muttered something about budget precedent. I told him precedent was exactly the problem, and the position stood. Dana cried a little the day I offered it to her, standing in my office doorway with a clipboard still in her hand. "Nobody's ever just noticed," she said, and didn't finish the sentence, though she didn't need to. I understood exactly the shape of what she meant, because I'd spent 6 years being the support beam in somebody else's ceiling, too. She built a training program over the following 2 years that cut new nurse error rates in our department by nearly a third, got invited to present it at a regional nursing conference, and now mentors incoming staff with the same quiet, unglamorous excellence nobody had bothered to properly reward for nearly a decade. I think about Dana often when people ask me what actually changed at Union Memorial under my leadership. It wasn't only the surgical outcomes. It was learning, department-wide, to notice the people who'd been holding the ceiling up the whole time, invisibly, without anyone thinking to ask if their arms were tired. That, too, was part of why the malpractice pattern I eventually found in Derek's charts didn't surprise me nearly as much as it probably should have. A department that had spent years failing to notice its most reliable people was exactly the kind of department where a mediocre surgeon, protected by family connections, could quietly cut corners for over a decade without anyone in a position of real authority ever properly checking his work. What I found, I couldn't unfind. It was an unremarkable Tuesday, 3 months into the job, when I sat down to do a routine quality review of closed cases from the previous 2 years. Standard practice for any incoming department chief. Nothing personal about it. Nothing targeted. One case stopped me cold. A 44-year-old man named Harold Priest had come in 18 months earlier with a ruptured spleen following a car accident. Derek had been the attending on call. The documentation showed a straightforward splenectomy, uncomplicated recovery, discharge on schedule. Except the imaging attached to the file told a different story. There was a second injury visible on the pre-op CT, a partial laceration to the left kidney, subtle but unmistakable to anyone reviewing the images carefully. The kind of finding that should have prompted either intervention or, at minimum, close monitoring. There was no mention of it anywhere in Derek's operative note. No follow-up imaging, no documented conversation with the patient about the risk. Harold Priest had been readmitted 4 months later with progressive kidney failure, ultimately requiring dialysis. The readmission had been handled by a different surgeon, who'd noted the old injury in passing without apparently connecting it back to the original trauma case. Or, I began to suspect, without being given the full original imaging to review. I pulled 3 more of Derek's closed cases that night, then 5 more. Then, over the following 2 weeks, every case from the last 3 years where his name appeared as primary surgeon. A pattern emerged that made my stomach turn in a way 15 years of trauma medicine hadn't fully prepared me for. Secondary findings quietly omitted from operative notes. Complications documented in ways that minimized his role in them. At least 2 other patients whose subsequent health problems traced back with varying degrees of directness to injuries his documentation had simply never mentioned. This wasn't the story of an average surgeon having an average surgeon's average bad outcomes. This was the story of a man who had spent over a decade protected by his father-in-law's shadow, quietly cutting corners because he'd never once had to answer for the ones he'd already cut. I sat with that file open on my desk for a long time before I made the call I knew I had to make. Before I made it, though, I did something I'm not entirely proud of in retrospect, though I understood it at the time as simple due diligence. I went back through 8 years of departmental incident reports, cross-referencing every case where Derek's name appeared as primary or supervising surgeon against readmission records, transfer records, and the sparse handful of formal complaints that had actually made it into writing rather than staying as hallway gossip. It took most of 2 weeks, working late most nights after my own cases were finished, Priya occasionally finding me still in my office at midnight and bringing me coffee without asking why. "You don't have to explain it to me," she said, the 3rd or 4th night she found me there. "I've had my own suspicions about his numbers for years. Nobody with the authority to actually look ever did." "I'm looking," I told her. "I know," she said. "That's sort of the whole reason everyone's glad you're here." The pattern that emerged wasn't dramatic in any single instance. That was, in some ways, the most disturbing part of it. No single case looked like obvious malpractice on its own. It was the aggregate that told the real story. Complications quietly minimized, follow-up care handed off before outcomes could be fully tracked, documentation written in a style that technically satisfied legal requirements while omitting anything that might invite closer scrutiny. It was the medical equivalent of a man who'd spent 15 years learning exactly how much corner cutting he could get away with, calibrated precisely to stay just below the threshold that would force anyone to actually look. I brought everything to the hospital's medical executive committee 2 weeks later, alongside Priya, whose independent chart review, done without her ever knowing what I'd already found, corroborated every one of my concerns down to the same 3 cases. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to the story. I did not enjoy that meeting. I had spent years imagining, in idle, unguarded moments, some fantasy of Derek's public humiliation, some scene where I got to stand over him triumphant while he finally understood what it felt like to lose everything he'd built on someone else's back. The reality was nothing like that fantasy. It was a conference room with fluorescent lighting, a stack of printed charts, and the flat procedural language of a peer review process that had nothing theatrical about it at all. Derek was called in. He was shown the imaging, the notes, the readmission records, laid out with the same clinical dispassion I'd have used presenting any case. I watched something in his face collapse in slow motion as he understood, in real time, that 15 years of quietly cutting corners had finally caught up to a version of himself he could no longer talk his way out of. He started and then stopped, because there was genuinely nothing left to say. The committee didn't need me to argue the case. The documentation argued it for me. The investigation that followed took 4 months. Harold Priest's care was reviewed by an independent panel. 2 additional cases were referred to the state medical board. Derek's surgical privileges were suspended pending the outcome, and when the state board's findings came back, they were unambiguous. A pattern of substandard documentation, delayed disclosure of surgical complications, and at least 1 case meeting the threshold for professional negligence. He wasn't stripped of his license outright. The board's sanctions rarely go that far on a first substantiated pattern. But he was placed on a multi-year probationary status, required to complete extensive remediation, and, perhaps most damaging of all in a field built on institutional trust, quietly and permanently unwelcome at Union Memorial and, word travels fast in medicine, at most hospitals of any real standing in the region. I want to tell you about Harold Priest specifically, because it would be easy, in a story like this one, to let him become just a name on a chart, evidence, essentially, rather than a person who actually lived through the consequences of somebody else's carelessness. I met him in person during the independent panel review, which invited him to describe, in his own words, what the 18 months following his original surgery had actually looked like from the inside. He was a soft-spoken man, a warehouse forklift operator, not so different in some ways from the woman I used to be on the loading docks in Columbus. And he described, without any particular anger in his voice, the slow, confusing decline that had followed his discharge. Fatigue he couldn't explain, swelling in his ankles nobody connected to anything. A series of doctors who kept treating each new symptom in isolation because nobody had the original imaging in front of them showing exactly where the problem had started. "I just want to understand," he told the panel, "whether somebody knew something back then that could have saved me some of this." Nobody in that room had a comfortable answer for him, including me. After the investigation concluded, I made a point of calling him myself, outside of any official capacity, just to tell him plainly what the imaging had shown and what it should have prompted at the time. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone. "Doesn't fix the kidney," he finally said. "But I appreciate somebody finally just telling me straight." We talked for a while longer than either of us probably expected to, about nothing in particular, his grandkids, the price of gas, the strange, unglamorous ordinariness that sits right alongside even the most serious medical conversations, if you let it. Before we hung up, he asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether the surgeon in question had ever explained himself. No, I told him honestly. I don't think he really could. Ivy finalized their divorce 3 weeks after the board's findings became public within hospital circles. She didn't gloat about it to me, and I never expected her to. She simply sent me a short, plain text. Thank you for doing your job honestly. It's more than he ever did for anyone. People love a revenge story with a satisfying ending, and I understand why. I've watched enough of them myself, late at night, in the years when I still needed the fantasy of Derek's downfall to get me through hard shifts. But I want to tell you honestly what it actually felt like, sitting in my office the evening the board's findings became final. Because it wasn't what 15 years of imagining had led me to expect. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel avenged. What I felt, mostly, was tired. And something close to sorrow. Not for Derek specifically, but for the sheer waste of it all. A man who'd had genuine talent once, genuine ambition, real promise across a diner table when we were 22 and broke and hopeful, had spent 15 years building a life so entirely on other people's labor and silence that when the silence finally broke, there was nothing underneath it that was actually his. I hadn't set out to destroy him. I'd set out to do my job honestly, and the truth had done the rest on its own, the way truth generally does if you give it enough documentation and enough time. There's a lesson in that I didn't fully understand until it happened to me. Real accountability rarely looks like the dramatic confrontation you picture in your angriest moments. It looks like a chart review on an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like doing your work so carefully that dishonesty simply can't survive next to it. Priya found me in my office that night, still going over the final report. "You okay?" she asked, leaning in the doorway. "I think so," I said, and meant it. I just thought it would feel different. Better or worse? I considered the question honestly. "Quieter," I said. I thought I wanted the loud version. Turns out, I just wanted it to be over. She sat down across from me and we talked for a while about the strange anticlimax of accountability done properly. How the version of justice you fantasize about during your worst nights almost never resembles the actual procedural, unglamorous machinery of a peer review committee reading spreadsheets under fluorescent lights. I used to imagine screaming at him, I admitted. Some big cinematic moment where I finally said everything I never got to say in that parking lot 15 years ago. Instead, I just presented the imaging. And the imaging did all the talking. "Maybe that's better, though," Priya said. A scream he could have dismissed as you being emotional, bitter ex-wife, all of that. The chart doesn't have an agenda. The chart's just true. She was right, and it took me another few days to fully understand why that distinction mattered so much to me. If I'd gotten Derek disciplined through some emotional confrontation, some dramatic reckoning fueled by 15 years of buried anger, there would have always been a version of the story where he got to cast himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife with an axe to grind. Instead, he'd been undone by something that had absolutely nothing to do with our marriage at all. Plain, careful documentation, reviewed by people with no personal stake in the outcome whatsoever. There was no story he could spin about that. There was just the truth, sitting there in black and white, entirely indifferent to his feelings about it. That, I think, was the actual gift buried inside the whole ordeal. not his punishment. The fact that his punishment had nothing to do with me at all. Which meant, for the first time in 15 years, I genuinely got to stop being a character in his story and simply become the author of my own. The department's numbers kept improving through that first year, and by the second, the improvements had become hard for anyone in the hospital's leadership to ignore. Our trauma mortality rates dropped below the regional average for the first time in nearly a decade. Priya, now a rising junior attending, co-authored a paper with me on austere environment trauma protocols adapted for urban settings that got picked up by a national surgical journal and, somewhat to my astonishment, cited in 3 other hospital systems' training materials within the year. The recognition, when it came, arrived faster and louder than I'd expected. A regional medical association gave the department an award for outcomes improvement. A national trauma surgery conference invited me to keynote, and afterward, a producer from a local Cleveland news affiliate reached out about doing a profile piece, the rural doctor who came back to run a big city trauma department, which was a simplification of my life I found almost funny, given how much of the real story that headline left out. I said yes to the interview mostly because Priya insisted it would be good for recruiting talented young surgeons who might otherwise never consider a career built around underserved and rural medicine. I sat under studio lights in my white coat, badge clipped neatly to the pocket, and talked about trauma protocols, about mentorship, about the particular satisfaction of building a department that finally matched the potential of the people inside it. I did not mention Derek Callahan once, not even when the reporter, fishing gently, asked about the personal journey that had brought me from a rural Montana clinic to Cleveland. I built a life I'm proud of, I told her. That's really the whole journey. The national conference keynote, a few months later, gave me more room to say what I actually meant. I stood in front of nearly 2,000 surgeons and residents in a Denver ballroom, the kind of room that would have been unimaginable to the woman who used to sell resin coasters online at midnight. And I talked about something I hadn't planned to talk about when I first drafted my notes. I'd meant to talk purely about trauma protocols, the technical substance of the invitation. But somewhere in the drafting, I found myself writing about something underneath the protocols instead. The particular kind of courage it takes to walk into a resource-scarce room and trust your own hands when there's nobody more qualified standing behind you. There's a myth in medicine, I told that room, that expertise arrives fully formed, handed down from some authority who finally decides you're ready. I want to tell you plainly that it doesn't work that way. Not really. Expertise arrives the way most real things arrive, slowly, in the dark. Usually while you're terrified, usually in a moment when there's genuinely no one else available to hand the responsibility to. I became a surgeon, in the truest sense, on a night with no working generator and no backup, closing a wound I'd never closed alone before, because there was nobody else in that building qualified to tell me not to. Nobody handed me a certificate that night. Nobody was even watching. I simply became, in the dark and the cold and the fear, the thing I'd spent years afraid I might never actually be. I watched a few hundred residents in that audience sit up a little straighter, the particular posture of people hearing something they didn't know they needed permission to believe about themselves. I'd also like to say something to anyone in this room who's built their competence the unglamorous way, I continued. Training in an underserved hospital or a rural clinic or a system nobody put on a magazine cover. Somebody in a boardroom somewhere may eventually tell you that you don't belong in the room they control. I'm telling you, from direct experience, that they are simply wrong, and that the actual arithmetic of medicine, outcomes, honesty, the steadiness of your own two hands under pressure, doesn't care in the slightest which zip code taught you to be good at your job. The applause afterward went on longer than I expected, and a line of young surgeons found me afterward in the hallway, several of them with stories eerily similar to my own. Years spent financing somebody else's ambition before finally, belatedly, turning that same discipline toward building something of their own. I gave out my email address more times that afternoon than I had in the previous 5 years combined, and I answered nearly every message that came in afterward, because I remembered too clearly what it had felt like to have nobody answer mine. The segment aired on a Thursday evening, and within the hospital, people talked about it for weeks. The kind of quiet, sustained pride that comes when a department finally has something worth being proud of. I didn't think, watching the broadcast that night in my apartment with a cup of tea going cold beside me, about who else in Cleveland might be watching too. I found out what happened next only because Priya told me, months later, having heard it secondhand from someone who used to work with Derek. He was living by then in a extended stay motel on the city's east side, the kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and thin walls that let in every argument happening 2 doors down. His probationary status had made steady employment nearly impossible to find. The remediation program was slow and expensive. Ivy had kept the condo in the divorce, along with most of what remained of the money her father's connections had once funneled his way. He was watching television that Thursday night, according to the account that reached me. Some cheap bottle of whiskey on the nightstand, the kind of evening that had apparently become fairly routine, when the local news came on, and there I was. Dr. Mara Bennett, Chief of Trauma and Vascular Surgery, being introduced as one of the region's most respected surgeons, discussing the department she'd rebuilt from the ground up. I wasn't there to see his face. I don't need to imagine it dramatically, and I won't pretend the story requires me to. What I know, because Priya heard it from someone who heard it from someone, is that he sat very still through the entire segment, and that afterward, the sound of something breaking, a glass maybe, hitting the motel's cheap linoleum floor, was loud enough that a neighbor complained. I felt strange hearing that second-hand account. Not satisfaction, not vindication, nothing dramatic enough to make a tidy ending out of. Mostly, I felt the particular relief of realizing that his ruin, whatever shape it took, belonged entirely to him now. It had nothing left to do with me. I had stopped being a character in Derek Callahan's story a long time before that television segment ever aired. The exact moment, if I'm being precise, that I closed Ray Deacon's wound alone in a dark clinic with a dying generator and understood that my life could belong completely to me. I don't want to give you the impression that the 2 years after my return to Cleveland were only about Derek, because in truth, they were mostly about the actual work. And I want to tell you about one case in particular, because it's the one that reminded me why I'd walked into that recruitment office in Columbus 15 years earlier in the first place. It was a Saturday night in late autumn, 8 months into my tenure as chief, when the trauma bay took a call about a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate. Black ice, 4 cars, a jackknifed semi. The first patient who came through my doors was a 19-year-old college student named Delilah Fournier, unconscious, blood pressure dropping despite 2 units already running, a belly that was rigid and distended in the specific way that tells a trauma surgeon, before any imaging comes back, that somebody is bleeding to death internally and there isn't time to wait for confirmation. I made the call to open her in the trauma bay rather than wait for a formal OR to free up, a decision straight out of the austere medicine protocols I'd built in Montana, the kind of call that academic surgeons trained entirely in well-resourced hospitals sometimes hesitate to make because it isn't the textbook sequence. Priya assisted. A resident named Owen, barely 6 weeks into his rotation, held retraction with hands that were shaking almost as badly as mine had shaken 15 years earlier over Ray Deacon's leg. We found the bleed, a lacerated splenic artery, the kind of injury that kills people in minutes, not hours. And I remember the strange, total quiet that settles over a room in that exact moment. The moment where every voice in your head goes silent, except the one telling your hands exactly what to do next. 15 years of training folded down into about 90 seconds of work. We got the bleeding controlled. Her pressure climbed back into a range that meant she was going to live to see Monday. Delilah Fournier walked out of that hospital 11 days later on her own 2 feet, and her mother, a woman I'd never met before that night, held both my hands in the hallway outside the recovery ward and cried in a way that made every single freezing winter night in that old Columbus studio apartment feel, retroactively, like it had been worth surviving. Owen, the resident whose hands had been shaking almost as badly as mine once had, came to find me the next morning before rounds, still visibly rattled by the intensity of the previous night. "I don't know how you stayed that calm," he said. "I thought I was going to be sick the whole time." I was terrified too, I told him honestly. The trick isn't getting rid of the fear. It's learning to keep working anyway, with the fear still sitting right there next to you. Nobody teaches you that in a textbook. You just have to survive one night where there's nobody else to hand it to, and something in you figures out how. He nodded slowly, the particular nod of someone filing information away somewhere it would actually stick. 2 years later, Owen matched into a trauma surgery fellowship of his own, and he sent me a short note afterward that simply read, "Still terrified most nights. Working anyway. Thank you for telling me that was allowed." I tell you this not because it's the flashiest part of the story, but because it's the truest one. The chapter of my life that mattered most was never really about Derek at all. It was about learning, the hard way, that I had it in me to be the person who saves someone, rather than the person who spends her whole youth funding someone else's chance to. Somewhere in that second year, I finally drove the 3.5 hours back to Zanesville to see my parents, something I'd put off, out of old stubbornness and older shame, for far longer than I should have. My mother cried when she opened the door, which I'd expected, and hugged me for a length of time that made my father clear his throat awkwardly behind her, which I'd also expected. What I hadn't expected was the framed newspaper clippings sitting on their mantel. The local Cleveland News profile piece, printed out and matted like a diploma, right between my high school graduation photo and my parents' wedding portrait. "We didn't know how to reach you for a long time," my mother admitted, once we were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between us, exactly the way it used to when I was a teenager coming home late. "You disappeared so completely. We understood why, eventually, but it still hurt." I told them, finally, the whole story. The envelope, the parking lot, the SIM card snapped in half over the sink. 15 years of a life built alone in a place they'd never even been able to picture clearly on a map. My father, a quiet man who rarely said much of anything, reached across the table at the end of it and put his rough, calloused hand over mine. "I always thought that boy talked too smoothly for someone who hadn't done anything yet to earn it," he said. It was, from him, about as close to an "I told you so" as he'd ever allowed himself, and it made me laugh for the first time in longer than I could remember. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere old and unguarded. I stayed the whole weekend. It was the first time in over a decade that going home had felt like coming towards something, instead of running from something else. He arrived on an ordinary Saturday morning in early spring, almost a year to the day after that television segment aired. I'd just finished an overnight shift, walking out of the hospital's main entrance into the kind of crisp, clean-aired morning that makes even a tired trauma surgeon feel briefly, improbably hopeful about the day ahead, when an olive-drab government SUV pulled up along the curb across the street. The door opened, and a man in a sharp state uniform stepped out, sun catching the silver at his temples that hadn't been there 15 years earlier, though the rest of him, the steady, unhurried way he moved, the particular quiet confidence I'd first noticed handing me coffee after a rescue, hadn't changed at all. Wyatt crossed the street toward me, and in his hands, incongruous against the gray Cleveland sidewalk, was a bundle of fireweed, Montana's own, the same wildflower pressed under glass in the little carved box he'd given me the day I left. "I took some leave," he said by way of explanation, stopping a respectful few feet away, the way he always had, never crowding a space I hadn't invited him into. "Saw the news piece. Figured somebody who flew into a storm to close a chainsaw wound alone in the dark deserved to have somebody show up for once, instead of always being the one showing up for everybody else." I took the flowers, and the faint, earthy smell of them pulled me straight back to that ridge, that clinic, those 15 winters that had made me who I actually was. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief. "That's a long flight for a bouquet," I said, my voice not quite steady. "Not really," he said, watching me with those same patient eyes. "Seeing you made the whole trip worth it before I even landed." We walked together down the sunlit street outside the hospital, not saying much, because we'd never really needed to. For 15 years, Wyatt Cross had shown up in the hardest moments of my life without once asking for anything in return. And standing there with fireweed in my arms on an ordinary Cleveland sidewalk, I understood, finally, that I was ready to let someone show up for the easy moments too. I won't pretend the months that followed were some seamless fairy tale. Learning to let someone care for me, after 15 years of building an entire identity around never needing anyone's care again, turned out to be its own kind of hard work. Quieter than trauma surgery, but not, in its own way, any less demanding. Wyatt transferred to a search and rescue unit based nearer to Cleveland, close enough that we could actually build something real instead of trading visits across 2,000 miles. He never pushed. He never once made me feel like healing on my own timeline was an inconvenience to him. And slowly, over the better part of a year, I found myself doing something I hadn't done with another person since I was 22 years old, at a diner table in Zanesville. I let myself imagine an actual future. One built with someone rather than for them. The difference, I came to understand, was everything. Derek had described a future to me, and then handed me the entire bill for building it alone. Wyatt simply showed up, again and again, without ever presenting an invoice. "You don't have to keep proving you're not a burden," he told me once, quietly, on an evening when I'd worked myself into exhaustion trying to make dinner, return 3 departmental emails, and prep for a morning surgery all at the same time, out of some old, worn-in reflex that said rest had to be earned. "I'm not keeping score, Mara. I never was." I cried the first time he said that. Not from sadness, but from the strange, disorienting relief of finally hearing it. There were smaller moments, too, that mattered just as much as that one, precisely because they were small. Wyatt learning, without being told, that I couldn't sleep properly the first week of any new on-call rotation, and simply making tea without comment on those particular nights, instead of asking what was wrong. Wyatt sitting through an entire tedious departmental fundraising gala because Priya had asked me to attend and I hadn't wanted to go alone. Never once checking his watch. Never once making his boredom my problem to manage. Wyatt calling my mother on her birthday unprompted the first year we were together, because he'd noticed, in passing conversation, that I always got quiet around that date, still carrying some old guilt about the years I'd been too consumed by Derek's ambitions to call home properly. I found myself, slowly, doing something I hadn't realized I'd stopped doing at all. Making small, ordinary requests and trusting they'd be honored without becoming leverage later. Asking him to pick up dinner on a night I was too exhausted to cook. Asking him to just listen without fixing anything after a difficult case. Asking, once, tentatively, whether he'd mind driving the 4 hours to Zanesville with me for a holiday, meeting my parents properly for the first time, and watching him say yes immediately, with no negotiation, no quiet tally of what he'd expect in return. It sounds like such a small thing, doesn't it? A man who simply does what he says he'll do, without turning it into a transaction. It didn't feel small to me. It felt, most days, like learning an entirely new language after spending 6 years fluent in a much crueler one.
"You keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Wyatt observed once, gently, watching me brace for some cost attached to an ordinary Tuesday he'd spent doing nothing more remarkable than fixing a leaking faucet in my apartment without being asked. "I don't have a shoe, Mara. I'm not going to drop one." I believed him a little more each year that passed without one ever landing, and somewhere along the way, without any single dramatic turning point I could point back to, I noticed that the bracing itself had quietly stopped. I still remember the specific evening I first noticed its absence. An ordinary dinner, nothing at all going wrong, and the sudden, almost disorienting realization that I hadn't spent a single minute of it waiting for something to go wrong. That absence, more than any grand romantic gesture, was the thing that finally convinced me this was real. I saw Derek one more time, almost 2 years after I'd taken the chief position, and it was so anticlimactic that I almost laughed about it afterward. I was leaving a pharmacy near the east side of the city on an ordinary Tuesday evening, arms full of a prescription for Wyatt's mother, who'd had knee surgery that week, when I saw him, across the parking lot, getting into an older sedan that had clearly seen better years. He'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy so much as depleted. His coat was a department store brand, nothing like the wool overcoats I remembered from that Chicago-adjacent life he used to wear like armor. He saw me too. There was a long moment where neither of us moved, the kind of moment that in a movie would swell with dramatic music, and in real life just felt awkward and a little sad. "Mara," he said finally, crossing halfway toward me, stopping a careful distance away, as if he understood, on some instinctive level, that he no longer had any claim to closing that gap further. "You look well." "I am well," I said, and meant it plainly, without cruelty and without warmth either, just fact, stated the way you'd confirm any other fact. "I heard about the award," he said, "the regional recognition. Congratulations." He said it like the word cost him something, which, I suppose, in whatever currency was left to him, it probably did. "Thank you," I said. There was a silence that stretched a beat too long, and I watched him visibly decide whether to say more, whether to reach for some kind of absolution I had no intention of offering him, whether to try, one more time, to make me the audience for his regret. He didn't, in the end. Maybe some remaining shred of dignity stopped him. Or maybe he simply understood, looking at my face, that there was nothing there for him to find anymore. Not anger, not longing, not even the satisfaction of watching him suffer that I might have wanted once in an angrier year. "Take care of yourself," he said instead, quietly, and got into his car. I stood in that parking lot for a moment after he drove off,
waiting to feel something enormous, the way I always half expected to whenever I imagined this exact scene over 15 years. What I actually felt was almost nothing. A small, clean absence where a wound used to be. The particular peace that only arrives once a person has genuinely, completely, stopped needing anything from you at all. I drove home and gave Wyatt's mother her prescription and made dinner and did not think about Derek Callahan again that night, or really in any way that mattered, ever again. People ask me sometimes, now that I train residents of my own, how I survived those first 6 years. The coupons, the frostbitten windows, the quilts sold at midnight, the particular exhaustion of building an entire life around someone else's ambition while quietly starving my own. I never tell them it was noble, because I don't actually believe that anymore, however much the story might sound that way from a distance. What I tell them instead is the truth. Devotion without reciprocity isn't love. It's servitude wearing love's clothing, and it will eat you alive if you let it go on long enough, because the person receiving it will very rarely stop you. Why would they? You're doing all the work of loving for both of you. I gave Derek Callahan 6 years of a version of myself I can never fully get back. The years when I should have been building my own foundation, learning my own trade, discovering my own capacity, instead of quietly financing someone else's. I don't regret the sacrifice entirely, because it taught me things about endurance I couldn't have learned any easier way. But I regret, deeply, that I mistook the size of my sacrifice for proof of its worth. I thought if I gave enough, endured enough, disappeared into his ambition thoroughly enough, eventually someone would notice and honor it. Nobody honors invisible labor. That's the hard lesson underneath this whole story, the one I wish somebody had told me plainly at 22, instead of letting me learn it from a certified mail envelope on a freezing sidewalk. If you have to make yourself smaller, quieter, and more exhausted to keep someone's love, that isn't love asking that of you. That's ambition, wearing love as a disguise. And ambition doesn't stop taking on its own. It has to be refused. It will not refuse itself on your behalf, no matter how patiently you wait, no matter how many years you give it to eventually notice what it's costing you. I refused it, eventually. 6 years too late, maybe. But I refused it completely, and everything that came after, the clinic, the degree, the scalpel, the department, Wyatt's steady patience, my parents' kitchen table, grew directly out of that one late, hard-won refusal. I think a lot of people, hearing this story, expect the satisfying part to be Derek's downfall, the malpractice review, the suspended privileges, the motel room, the shattering glass. I understand why. Revenge is the part of a story like this one that feels the most narratively complete, the part that makes you want to pump your fist and say, he got what he deserved. But I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the revenge does. The actual turning point of my life was never Derek's ruin. It was mine. And it happened years before he ever lost anything at all. It happened on a February night in a dark clinic with a dead generator, closing a wound alone for the first time, and discovering I could. Everything after that, the degree, the fellowship, the department, even the eventual reckoning he faced for his own choices, was simply what grew, slowly and honestly, out of that one moment of proving something to myself that nobody else needed to witness. Revenge is loud. It needs the other person to see it, to feel it, to suffer visibly enough that you can measure your victory against their pain. Dignity is quieter than that, and, in my experience, far more durable. Dignity is signing divorce papers with a steady hand instead of dragging out a fight. It's refusing a settlement that feels like being paid to disappear. It's doing your work so carefully for so many years that eventually nobody in the room can question whether you belong in it.
It's standing across a parking lot from the person who once told you that you weren't in his social class anymore, and feeling nothing at all, because your worth stopped depending on his recognition a very long time before that moment ever arrived. The greatest victory of this entire story was never watching Derek Callahan lose his career. It was realizing, calmly, in a pharmacy parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday, that his losing it no longer had the power to move a single thing in my chest. I've come to believe that most people who've survived something like this spend years chasing the wrong kind of ending, because it's the only kind our culture really teaches us to want. We're taught to root for the dramatic comeuppance, the public unmasking, the moment the person who wronged us finally, visibly suffers in proportion to what they cost us. I understand the appeal. I wanted it too, for years, in the specific, gnawing way you want something you've told yourself you're owed. But wanting someone else's ruin keeps your whole life orbiting around them, even in the fantasy, even in the daydream where you finally win. You're still building the story around their downfall instead of your own becoming. I didn't actually get free of Derek Callahan the day the medical board suspended his privileges. I got free of him years earlier, alone, in a dark clinic, closing a wound with hands that had stopped waiting for anyone's permission to be capable. There's a reason why it kept giving me fireweed, and it took me a long time to fully understand it, even after he explained it the first time. Fireweed is one of the first plants to return after a wildfire strips a landscape down to blackened, seemingly lifeless ground. It doesn't wait for the soil to recover on its own. It roots directly into the scorched earth and blooms there, bright violet pink against ash, before almost anything else has dared to come back. Foresters call it a pioneer species, the plant whose job is to prove, quickly and stubbornly, that a burned place can still grow something. I think about that a lot, looking back on the version of myself who walked away from a Cleveland parking lot 15 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag, a few $1,000s, and a stubborn refusal to let betrayal write the rest of my story. I had no map, no guarantee, no protector waiting on the other side of that decision to catch me if it went badly. I only had the same thing fireweed has, an unreasonable, almost irrational insistence on growing anyway, directly in the burned place, before the ground had any right to expect something to bloom there. That refusal was small at first, barely a decision at all, more like a reflex, the simple act of getting on a bus instead of going home to cry in an empty studio apartment. But every day I chose it again, chose to study instead of grieve, chose to work instead of wait, chose to build instead of beg for an explanation I was never actually owed. It grew sturdier, the way a root system grows sturdier the longer a plant survives in hostile ground. Eventually, it became strong enough to carry me from a freezing 400-square-foot studio to an operating room where my own 2 hands could save someone else's life. I don't think healing always arrives like fireworks, the way movies like to show it, a single dramatic moment where everything painful resolves at once. Sometimes, healing arrives the way Wyatt did, quietly, patiently. A man who waited without demanding anything, who respected my solitude instead of trying to fix it, who saw my strength without ever once trying to own it for himself. I didn't need another person to complete my life by the time he showed up with that first bouquet of fireweed. I had already become whole enough, on my own, in the wilderness, and in an operating room, and at my parents' kitchen table,
to receive kindness without mistaking it for another debt I'd have to spend years quietly repaying. That, too, was part of the blooming. 3 years into my tenure at Union Memorial, a new intern named Grace Whitmore rotated through my department, and something about her reminded me so precisely of myself at 22 that it nearly stopped me cold the first time I reviewed her file. She was working 2 jobs to support a fiancé finishing his own residency in cardiology across town, staying up late doing his laundry and proofreading his research papers between her own brutal call shifts, quietly falling behind in her own reading because there wasn't time left in the day for both his ambitions and hers. I recognized the particular exhaustion in her eyes, not the ordinary tiredness of medical training, but the specific, hollowed-out fatigue of a person who has quietly decided her own needs come somewhere after everyone else's. I pulled her aside after a difficult overnight shift, the 2 of us alone in the physician's lounge with bad coffee going cold between us, and I told her something I wished, more than almost anything else in my life, that someone had told me at 22. "You can support somebody you love," I said. "That's not the problem. The problem is when supporting them quietly becomes the entire shape of your life, and you stop noticing there used to be a you underneath all that supporting." I told her, briefly, the outline of my own story, not the dramatic parts, not Derek's name, just the plain shape of it. 6 years given away. A future built for someone who never once asked whether I had a future of my own worth protecting. Grace cried a little, sitting there in the lounge. And then she did something that made me prouder than almost any surgical outcome I've ever produced. She went home that week and had an honest conversation with her fiancé about what an equal partnership was actually supposed to look like. 2 years later, she finished her own residency in trauma surgery, on schedule, with her own name on her own research, and her fiancé, now husband, had learned, somewhere in the process, how to do his own laundry. I keep a small stack of thank you notes from residents like Grace in the bottom drawer of my desk, not out of vanity, but because on hard days, they remind me why any of the last 15 years happened at all. Not to prove Derek Callahan wrong. To make sure fewer women after me had to learn the hard way what devotion without reciprocity actually costs. Wyatt proposed on an unremarkable Sunday afternoon in the botanical garden near his new station, in front of an entirely ordinary bed of perennials that had nothing whatsoever to do with fireweed, which I think he did on purpose because he'd once told me, half joking, that he didn't want our whole relationship permanently tangled up with a flower that also happened to symbolize disaster recovery. I'd stopped bracing for the other shoe by then entirely, and I remember noticing, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that I hadn't once flinched watching him reach into his jacket pocket. "I've thought about how to do this for longer than I probably should have," he admitted, a small velvet box already open in his hand before I'd even fully registered what was happening. "I kept thinking I needed some big gesture, a helicopter, a mountaintop, something worthy of everything you've survived." He shook his head slightly, looking almost sheepish, which was not an expression I'd seen often on a man who routinely flew into blizzards to pull strangers off cliff faces. "But I think what you actually deserve is just somebody ordinary and steady, asking plainly, without needing it to be a spectacle. So, Mara Bennett, would you marry me?" I said yes before he'd even finished lowering himself onto one knee, which made him laugh, a full, surprised laugh I didn't get to hear often enough, given how carefully he usually held himself. And I understood, standing there in an unremarkable garden on an unremarkable Sunday, that this was exactly the kind of ending I actually wanted. Not fireworks, not vindication, Just an ordinary, steady man asking an ordinary, steady question, entirely without an invoice attached. We married the following spring, a small ceremony at a lodge outside the Bitterroot, close enough to the old clinic that Walt Hargrove, 84 by then, and moving slower but still sharp as ever, was able to attend, along with Ray Deacon and a dozen other faces from the community that had first taught me what it meant to build a life that belonged entirely to me. My parents sat in the front row. My father cried, which I'd never once seen him do, not even at my first wedding. And I think that told me more about the difference between these two marriages than almost anything else could have. The ceremony itself was small and unpolished in exactly the way I wanted it to be. No string quartet, no ice sculpture of anyone's professional accomplishments. Just a lodge deck overlooking a valley still patched with late spring snow, string lights someone had wound through the porch railing, and a local minister who'd married half the ranching families in the valley over the past 30 years and knew, without being told, to keep the whole thing mercifully brief. Dana flew out from Cleveland, and Priya, now running her own trauma service at a hospital 2 states away, gave a toast at the small reception afterward that made the entire room laugh and then, by the end of it, made most of the room cry, describing the exact expression on my face the first time she'd watched me, months into my tenure as chief, close a difficult abdominal case in under half the time the previous chief had ever managed. "She didn't just fix our department," Priya said, raising her glass. "She showed the rest of us what it looks like to actually stop apologizing for being good at your job." Wyatt's vows were short, plain, and utterly unadorned, exactly like the man himself. "I've spent my whole career flying toward the worst day of somebody's life, trying to get there before it's too late," he said, looking at me across the small, gathered crowd. "You taught me something I didn't expect a search and rescue pilot to still need to learn at 41. That showing up isn't only worth something in an emergency. It's worth just as much on an ordinary Tuesday, when nothing's wrong at all, and you simply choose to be there anyway." I don't remember much of my own vows, honestly, beyond the fact that I cried through most of them, and Walt Hargrove, sitting in the front row in a suit that clearly hadn't been worn since some other wedding decades earlier, muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "About time," loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear. We danced, later, on that same porch deck, under string lights and a sky bright with more stars than Cleveland ever let you see. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this exact unremarkable, unspectacular happiness was worth every single frozen winter it had taken 15 years to earn. We spent our honeymoon, at my insistence, back on the ridge, not out of any need to relive the hardest years of my life, but because I wanted Wyatt to see, properly, in daylight and without the exhaustion of a work shift attached, the exact place where I'd first understood I could become someone. The clinic had grown considerably since I'd left it, a real regional medical center now, with reliable power and a small teaching program that brought young providers in from across the state to learn austere environment medicine directly from the people who'd built the model. A young physician named Dr. Sophia Reyes ran the surgical department now, and she met me at the door with the specific, slightly awestruck reverence junior doctors sometimes reserve for the person whose old case reports they'd studied in training. "They still tell the story about the chainsaw injury," she told me, walking us through the updated facility. "The one you closed alone during the generator failure. It's practically legend up here." I laughed, a little embarrassed, and told her the truth, that I'd been more terrified in that moment than I'd ever admitted to anyone. That fear hadn't made me brave. It had simply sharpened my hands enough to keep working through it. She wrote that down, actually wrote it down in the small notebook she carried, the same kind of notebook I used to fill with anatomical diagrams by lantern light 15 years earlier. We drove out that same afternoon to visit Walt at the small cabin he'd retired to a few miles from the clinic, and found him exactly as stubborn and sharp as ever, grudgingly using a cane he insisted was just for the ice, and complaining at length about a new physician on staff who apparently asked too many questions before making a decision. "Sounds familiar," I told him, and he snorted, which from Walt Hargrove counted as genuine affection. He took Wyatt's hand and studied him for a long moment, with the same appraising look he'd once given me on that porch 15 years earlier. "You treat her right?" he asked, without preamble. "Every day I can manage it," Wyatt said, entirely serious. Walt grunted his approval and turned back to me. "Good," he said. "You did good, kid. On all of it." It was, from him, close to the highest praise I'd ever received in my life, and I held on to it the entire drive back down the mountain, the way you hold on to the rare compliment from someone who never gives them lightly. Standing in that clinic with my husband beside me and a new generation of doctors carrying forward what Walt Hargrove had first taught me, I understood something I don't think I could have understood any other way. Nothing about my story had actually ended with Derek's downfall, or even with my own success. It had simply kept going, the way fireweed keeps spreading, root by root, long after the fire that first burned the ground is entirely forgotten by everyone except the plant itself. I don't know exactly who's listening to this story, but I have a fairly good guess, because stories like this one don't usually reach people who aren't already standing somewhere close to where I once stood, holding an envelope you didn't expect, or lying awake doing math on money you don't have for a future that quietly stopped including you somewhere along the way, or simply sensing, in that low, persistent way you can't quite ignore, that you've become smaller inside your own life than you used to be. If that's you, I want to tell you plainly what I wish somebody had told me on that freezing sidewalk in Columbus 15 years ago, instead of letting me learn it alone on a Greyhound bus at dawn. The first step after betrayal is rarely brave-looking. It's ugly and lonely, and it will not feel romantic or cinematic while you're actually living through it. You may not feel courageous at all. You may only feel numb, and that's fine, because numb feet can still walk you to a bus station. Trembling hands can still pack a duffel bag. A broken heart, however shattered, can still choose a direction and start moving in it, one unremarkable day at a time. Courage very rarely looks like the speech you picture yourself giving in the shower at 2 a.m., the perfect, cutting words you'll never actually say to the person who hurt you. Courage, in my experience, looks much smaller and much quieter than that. It looks like simply refusing to go back to the place or the person that taught you to beg for basic respect. It looks like signing a piece of paper with a steady hand and mailing it back before you lose your nerve. It looks like a community bulletin board flyer you almost walk past and don't. If you are the kind of person who works 2 jobs, sends the money, waits quietly, loves faithfully, and asks for very little in return, please hear me clearly. That isn't weakness, whatever anyone has told you, whatever your own exhausted mind whispers to you at 2 a.m. That's real power. But that power has to eventually belong to you, and only you, or it will simply keep being spent by whoever's closest to your generosity, for as long as you let them. Devotion becomes dangerous the moment it's poured entirely into someone who treats it as fuel instead of as a gift to be cherished and reciprocated. The instant you notice your loyalty is being consumed rather than honored, you are entirely, completely allowed to stop giving it away. Nobody is coming to grant you permission for that. You simply have to take it. What ultimately saved me wasn't hatred, and it certainly wasn't revenge, however satisfying Derek's eventual reckoning turned out to be, in its own quiet, procedural way. What saved me was purpose. Every patient I treated in that mountain clinic moved me one step further from the frightened woman who once stood shaking behind an oak tree with divorce papers in her coat pocket. Every skill I mastered handed me back a small piece of the future somebody else had once tried to convince me I didn't deserve to keep. By the time I walked back through the doors of that Cleveland hospital 15 years later, I wasn't coming back to prove anybody wrong. I want you to understand that distinction clearly, because I think it's the actual heart of this whole story. I was coming back because the world had finally opened a door I'd earned, entirely on my own, by walking alone through storms nobody else had ever offered to help me survive. That door is still open. If you're standing where I once stood, holding your own version of that envelope, I promise you, yours can be too. I think, too, about what I'd say to the version of Derek that existed before any of this happened. The boy at the diner table describing a future he genuinely believed in, before ambition curdled into entitlement, and entitlement curdled into the particular cruelty of a man who thought loyalty was something you were owed rather than something you earned. I don't hate that boy. I think, in some ways, I still feel a kind of distant clinical sadness for him. The way you might feel sadness for any patient whose illness was ultimately preventable and who simply refused, again and again, the treatment that could have saved him. Talent without integrity eventually collapses under its own weight. It just sometimes takes longer than you'd expect, and it very rarely collapses in the dramatic, satisfying way revenge fantasies promise you it will. What I actually got, instead of a satisfying collapse, was something quieter and, in the end, far better. An entire life built patiently and honestly that had absolutely nothing to do with him. A department full of people like Dana and Priya and Grace, who I got to watch become the fullest versions of themselves instead of the smallest. A husband who never once presented an invoice for his own steadiness. A mountain clinic that still to this day sends me a Christmas card every year with a photograph of whichever new class of rural providers is training there, carrying forward something I helped build out of nothing but stubbornness and a broken heart. If there's one last thing I want to leave you with, it's this. The ending of a story like mine was never really about what happened to the person who hurt me. It was about what I built in the years I stopped waiting for him to notice. Build that. Build it whether or not anyone ever apologizes. Build it especially if they don't. The building is the whole point, and it will still be standing long after everything you're currently grieving has quietly, finally, stopped mattering at all. Start today if you can. Start small if that's all you have in you right now. Just start. The end. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, the exhaustion of funding someone else's dream, the particular silence after a betrayal you didn't see coming, I hope you'll remember the same thing I eventually had to learn the hard way. Numb feet can still walk. Trembling hands can still pack a bag, and a broken heart can still choose a direction. That's enough to start. It was enough for me.